Good afternoon, welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Brierley and I'm with you for this afternoon's Unbelievable. And I can tell you, you'll need to engage your brain for this afternoon's discussion as our Christian and non-Christian go head to head on the subject of religion and science, God and science. I'll give you more details in just a moment. Firstly, though, thank you to all who have gone before. David Aldous for Passages of Life and the breakfast team this morning. And don't forget, plenty more to come on Premier this Saturday afternoon. If you're around in the house, in the car or wherever, then do keep tuned for Father John Twistleton. That's immediately after this programme. He'll be bringing us another short reflection on the foundations of our faith, as in the Christian faith, that is. You can hear the best of Premier in Premier's playback. That's from 3:30 till 4. And between 4 and 6, of course, those fresh young talents, Dave and B, will be here with Hip Rock UK. Right now, it's time to talk about science and God.
You're unbelievable.
The title of Dr. John Lennox's latest book is God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? It's really a response to what Dawkins has had to say recently about God and about science, and the fact that he believes science has more or less made belief in God obsolete. Well, John Lennox, who's a professor in Oxford of mathematics and the philosophy of science, says as far as he's concerned, actually science points towards a designer God in all kinds of areas. We're going to be hearing why he believes that. We're going to be hearing a response from atheist humanist Robert Stovold, and Robert's own background is in evolutionary biology. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. Hope you can stay with me here on Unbelievable. And it's worth mentioning that John, the Oxford professor who we've got on the programme this afternoon, was engaged in debate with none other than Richard Dawkins last week. They had a televised debate in the deep south of America, and you can actually get hold of a copy of that from the Fixed Point Foundation. That's fixed-point.org if you want to get hold of that. And he's going to be telling us a little bit about that debate with the arch-atheist, as it were, Dawkins. So stay tuned, and we'll be meeting our guests very shortly on the programme. Just a look back at last week, and as I told you, last week we started for the first time podcasting. You've been able for a long time to listen back to shows on the webpage for Unbelievable, but for the first time now you're able to actually download it to an MP3 player. Well, we're going to, just to remind you about that, if you want to get online and download past editions of the programmes, they're put up there every week. There's a fresh edition. You can go there. That's premier.org.uk/radio. And click on Unbelievable, and then you can click the option to podcast. Just a couple of you have emailed in to say that you're grateful for that facility. Thanks to Nick Priest. You say that you're really pleased with that. And also Stuart, you say thanks for putting Unbelievable past shows on the web. I've just listened to the New Age and yoga discussions, and I'm listening live more often as you're on Freeview 725. We are indeed, Nick. And there's all sorts of different ways to listen now, aren't there? A couple of emails as well in response to last week's programme. We had a debate, well, it was more a discussion really. There was not a great deal of disagreement, if I'm honest, on the subject of pacifism and the Buddhist way of seeing things. And we were looking at that in the context of Burma and the peaceful demonstrations by monks there. But Reginald emails in. He's not particularly convinced by the Buddhist standpoint. You say the armchair pacifist and or Buddhist may luxuriate in a self-centred absolute pacifism only when and after others have shed their blood and laid down their very lives. So indeed the Dalai Lama et al. May indeed preach mindless non-violence against the Chinese, since he's now escaped to the freedom and hard-gained peace of the West. And you say other things about Buddhism, culminating in saying that revelation is divine truth, which can only be received by human beings because God desires to make himself known through the history of Judeo-Christian revelations in the books of the Bible. Buddhism is a philosophical psychology which seeks a self-obsessed inner satisfaction in one's own escapist private oblivion. Well, strong terms there from Reginald, but thank you for your email. And just quickly, greetings to Anderson Marquez, who emails me from Brazil to say he's listening online there. You say you're a member of the Assembly of God there. You've just been baptised for about a year now, and even though you're living on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, you're able to listen to the programme on a regular basis, and you get a lot out of it. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who's listening around the world. Do email unbelievable@premier.org. UK. We're going to be meeting our guests for our programme on science versus God. Is there really a conflict? We're going to be looking at that. And first of all, though, we're going to be hearing from the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. I don't know if you're into this band. Radiohead is the subject of today's thought.
Connecting with Culture.
In Rainbows, written by Jason Gardner. £5, that's my first confession. The price I paid for being able to download In Rainbows, the new album from Radiohead. If I was Bill Gates, I could have handed over the equivalent of the GDP of some small country to purchase it. I could have paid diddly squat. As no doubt has already been discussed ad infinitum around your nearest watering hole, Radiohead have asked you to name your price for their latest offering. My second confession is that I haven't brought a Radiohead album in 10 years. OK Computer sits on my shelf, but subsequent albums, Kid A, Amnesiac and Hail to the Thief are absent. So genius marketing then, irresistible novelty and hype money can't buy, and a call home for prodigals like me who've forsaken the Radiohead fold for so long. More than this though, Radiohead have become rock and roll. The music industry has long been staid. It's sold rebellion for so long that all it's capable now of delivering is inevitable pastiche. Goth in a bottle, new metal in a can. The Kaiser Chiefs, perhaps the most honest and prescient of their modern Britpop peers, said it so well in their recent single, Everything is Average Nowadays. Now here come true rebels, or at least true auteurs, remaining faithful to their vision, and at the same time asking an untold host to pick up hammer and nail and seal down the lid on the coffin that is the music business. It's been done before. Prince gave his album 3121 away through the Daily Mail in July this year. But this is Radiohead, postmodern prophets, media darlings and trendsetters. It's already rumoured that the likes of Nine Inch Nails, Oasis and Jamiroquai are intent on following suit and offering their albums for free. Of course, it's been pointed out that Radiohead can afford to do this. Smaller artists who have not garnered as much popularity won't be able to make a living by going it alone. But Radiohead throughout their entire career have surely been at pains to point out that making music in order to make money is simply not living. Their intent seems clear in House of Cards from the album. Forget about your house of cards and I'll deal mine. The infrastructure will collapse. Something has been torn down, and in its place something beautiful, something colourful presents itself. In Rainbows hints that after the flood, there is a promise of new life.
That was Connecting with Culture, brought to you by the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Good afternoon, welcome back. And I've been looking forward to this programme for some time because for a long time I've been really interested in this intersection between religion and science. And of course, you can hardly pick up a paper these days without seeing some form or way in which this is being played out in some kind of arena. Well, I'm joined today on the programme by Dr. John Lennox. He's a reader in mathematics at Oxford University and fellow in mathematics and the philosophy of science at Green College in Oxford. He's recently taken part in a TV debate with Richard Dawkins in the States. We'll be finding out a little bit about that. And he's also the author of God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? And that's from Lion Publishers. And we're going to be looking at some of the things he has to say in that book about why he believes that, in fact, science in very many ways points to the existence of a creator, a designer. But taking exception to that view today is Robert Stovold. Robert has a background in evolutionary biology. He studied zoology at university and went on to do further study in that area. He's an atheist, he's a humanist, and he would admit, I think, probably to being quite influenced by the works of Richard Dawkins over a period. So let's meet our guests and perhaps first of all say hello to our atheist, Robert Stovold. Thank you for coming on the programme, Robert.
Hello, thank you. Yes, thanks for inviting me as well.
You're very welcome. You've come all the way from Brighton to be with us today, so thank you for that. And tell us a little bit about yourself. Always had an interest in science?
I have, yes. My mother tells me that ever since I could crawl, I used to go out into the garden, imprison animals in jam jars and study them on the kitchen table. So obviously I've always had an interest in the natural world and trying to find out how things work. And that led to me learning more about the sciences at school and moving on to university. And I think it was evolutionary biology when I read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, I became aware of just how fundamental some of the questions are that evolutionary biology asks. And those are the kind of questions I find really interesting.
And the explanation you find to be compelling as far as...
I do, yes, because it took, when I read the book, it took certain things. For example, why do bees sting in defence of the hive and therefore die? Isn't that the last kind of thing evolution predicts they should do? And what the book does is it comes up with very good, testable, verifiable explanations for why bees do these surprising things, and shows that they're actually firmly rooted in evolutionary theory.
And has your atheism, if you like, a non-belief in God, always gone alongside that sort of scientific rigour?
I think the atheism was... I don't really remember ever kind of explicitly... Maybe I sort of believed in God, but I never fully accepted it. It always seemed a bit of a strange explanation I kind of went along with without ever really fully believing it. And then it just sort of faded away. Another reason why it faded away was not an academic argument, but the fact that I have temporal lobe epilepsy, and some of the feelings I've had there, feelings of, on the one hand, profound wonder at the universe, and also a kind of sometimes very frightening feeling that I don't understand anything. I've had both of those feelings, and to me, the simplest way of explaining them is simply a sort of malfunction in the brain. It took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that these feelings of profound belief that I've discovered some truth that other people don't have access to. I just think, I've seen the world in a way other people haven't. Because I knew it was outside of my normal way in which I experienced the world. And then I began to think, well, I don't think that's true, actually. I know that I've seen the world in a wonderful way, but I've also seen it in a terrifying way where nothing makes sense, and I can walk past people who I know and don't recognise them. So to me, it just shows that these things arise from the brain rather than reflecting what's really out there.
That's extremely interesting, and maybe we'll get a chance to pursue that later on. But for the moment, you're here, as it were, responding really to what John has to say, particularly in his book, which you've had a chance to read.
Yes.
And well done for that. I don't often ask guests who come on this programme to read a whole book in advance, but you've done that. You've read this book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? And obviously it covers a wide range of issues. Your particular field is really evolutionary biology, and so perhaps you're best equipped to respond to some of John's arguments on that front. But you know, the general thesis that science, it's you can easily see a kind of the traces of design in various aspects of it, you would totally fundamentally deny.
Well, there's an appearance of design there in the sense that complicated things, for example, the human eye, couldn't have come about simply by chance. And a lot of people think that that's all evolution is. It's just randomness. But it's a lot more than that. If you think evolution is random, you haven't understood evolution. It contains a random element, namely mutation, but it also contains a non-random element, natural selection. To give a very stark example of natural selection, if you were to get a fish and a lion and drop them both on the ground, it's not random which one's going to survive. The lion is very obviously going to survive, and the fish very obviously isn't. There's nothing random about it. But because it's not random, we don't therefore jump to the conclusion that it must be guided by God. It's obvious from very simple principles that if you get a fish and a lion and dump them on the ground, the fish is going to die and the lion isn't. You have non-randomness, but there's no need to leap to a supernatural design to explain the non-randomness.
Okay, well, we'll get into these issues later on in the programme, and a fascinating discussion I think it's going to be. Welcome also to Dr. John Lennox. Thank you for joining me, John.
It's a pleasure.
And you were on our breakfast show earlier in the week.
That's right.
Fielding a few questions from listeners and explaining one or two things. But let's have a bit of your background again. I can tell by that lovely Irish brogue that you come from
I come from Northern Ireland, actually from Armagh, where the famous Bishop Usher lived a long time ago. So in some people's eyes, I have a lot to live down.
That being, for those who aren't in the know, one of the originators, if you like, of strict creationism in the way
That's
that
right,
often
yes.
is put across by some people. But you grew up with a Christian background, did you?
I did, yes. My parents and grandparents were Christians, but rather remarkably, in a sectarian society, they allowed me to think. And that was the greatest gift they gave me. I was encouraged to read all kinds of literature. And I don't mean simply Christian literature. I remember my father saying, you better read the Communist Manifesto, it'll do you good. So secular literature, humanist literature, right from early days, I was fascinated by people who didn't share my worldview.
Mm-hmm. And you've gone on to great things. You obviously have various letters after your name denoting various doctorates and things. But perhaps most interestingly, in recent times at least, you've become one of the players in a field where there seems to be this war being waged between whether science, is against God or whether science points towards God. And you certainly are on the side of those who are defending science in the face of rationalists and atheists such as Richard Dawkins. How did you get involved in this whole discussion? I
got involved in it a very long time ago. When I first came to Cambridge, in my first week, a student asked me, did I believe in God? And then said, oh, sorry, you're Irish. You all believe in God. And you fight about it. And that wasn't the first time I'd had a similar intellectual challenge, but it was the first time I thought, well, I'm doing a fairly self-respecting academic subject, and I will have to investigate this. So on that day, I started befriending atheists, and I've been doing it ever since. And my interest in the naturalistic worldview has taken me to Russia and the former Soviet Union, discussing in academies of science and universities and so on and so forth. I've always been interested, particularly in people who've been systematically exposed to atheism in their education system. So although this book has relatively recently been written, my interest goes back a very long time.
Of course, the name that springs to most people's lips in this whole area is Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, still topping bestseller charts and things like that. People are interested in reading about, whether God exists. In many ways, your latest book is a sort of a riposte to Richard Dawkins. And what essentially are you saying? Because this is a book which covers a lot of ground, isn't it?
It is. I think there are two things to be distinguished here. Richard Dawkins' recent book, The God Delusion, is really a vanguard book for the people who call themselves the new atheists. And it covers very much more ground than the science theology debate, because, as Richard himself says, what has radicalized him, and I'm quoting an interview with Der Spiegel in Germany, was 9/11 and the feeling that religion leads to violence and war and so on. And of course there I find a great deal of sympathy with him. I would just want to distinguish very carefully between religions and so on. So that my book, although it refers to the God Delusion, was written essentially before the God Delusion came out and concentrates on the science and theology aspects. I'm actually writing another one to talk about the much more general questions that the new atheists are putting out into the public arena.
And you were recently engaged in a direct debate with Richard Dawkins.
I was, just last week.
Indeed, you've only just really arrived back from the States.
In Alabama.
In Alabama.
In the deep south, that's right.
Exactly, the heartland, really, of Christian, belief. But what was the circumstances and what led to that exchange?
The circumstances were that both Richard Dawkins and myself were invited to debate, and he agreed and I agreed. And I accepted because I thought it would be very interesting to do, almost symbolic thing to do down in the deep south. And it turned out to be a very agreeable meeting with Richard Dawkins, and we had a debate which was moderated by a very well-known federal judge on 6 of the theses of his book, which he unpacked and to which I responded. And we had a pack out, and there was tremendous interest from both sides, and it's now on Richard Dawkins' website for everybody to hear.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, you can access it there. And as I understand it, obviously you don't very often find Richard Dawkins pitching up and having these kind of debates in public. So lots of people were really pleased that this happened. I mean, was there a sense in which either side won or...
Well, I think that's the problem with debates. And as he told me just as we came onto the platform, he said, I don't normally debate. And I said to him, I know. And in a sense, I don't either. Because the idea of having a formal debate where there's a vote and then you listen to the arguments and then another vote tends to bring out the worst in people because they get aggressive to score points and so on. And what interests him and what interests me is having a rational discussion of these issues. I agree with him wholeheartedly when he said, look, we oughtn't to give religion more respect than anything else. We ought to discuss it like we do, politely and so on. And I'm all for that. And so there was a real basis, and neither Dawkins nor I is a postmodern relativist. We believe that there's truth out there, and I suspect, Robert, you're not one either,
yes.
You see. So that gives a basis for discussion. And I firmly believe that we can discuss, people listen to the arguments that are civilly and politely demonstrated, and they decide for themselves.
Well, if you are interested in listening to that debate in its full form, you can actually get hold of, I think, either an audio or a TV DVD copy of that from the Fixed Point Foundation, who are the sponsors of that particular discussion.
Larry Taunton of the Fixed Point Foundation set the whole thing up. He met me at Oxford. He met Richard Dawkins in Oxford, and he organised it brilliantly. So they're producing a DVD within the next month.
Well, we'll give the address of that a bit later on in the programme, the web address, for if you want to maybe grab hold of a copy of that. And of course, you're very welcome as well to get hold of a copy of John's book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? It's featured at the moment on the Premier shop. If you want to go there, premier.org.uk/shop. You can purchase a copy online. But we're going to be looking at some of the arguments in the book and some of the problems that Robert believes exist with the way John sees life, the universe and God. And we're going to be doing that over the next hour or so. So I hope you can stay with us for what I think is going to be a really fascinating discussion between our guests here. Dr. John Lennox, Oxford professor of mathematics and the philosophy of science, and also Robert Stovold, who is our atheist scientist. His background is in evolutionary biology. We're going to be continuing this debate very soon after a short break.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
And the title very apt, of course, this afternoon, because our guests have very differing opinions on science and religion. Dr. John Lennox is an Oxford professor. He says that science points to God, points to design, a creator. Robert Stovold is firmly of the opposite opinion. He says science really has eliminated the need for belief in God. So we're asking, has science buried God? That's the subtitle, if you like, of John Lennox's book on the subject. And we're going to be looking at all sorts of areas, belief and science. Are they two completely separate realms? What about the universe we live in? John makes claims in his book about the fact that it's so fine-tuned, and the mathematics behind that can hardly be ascribed to anything but some kind of designer behind the scenes, as it were. And that applies as well to aspects of evolution and more. We're going to be looking at these types of questions. And remember, if you have a question yourself or a point to put across, you're very welcome to share it with us. And I'll be giving out the number and the email address for you to leave your comments later on in the programme. Before we maybe get started, Robert, I know you wanted to maybe just clarify and define some of the terms that we're going to be using in our discussion today. We're talking about God and science. Well, it would be worth maybe defining what we mean by those two things. Tell us, what's your particular thinking on this then?
Well, I think before a scientist answers a question, they formulate it very carefully. So, has science buried God? Well, what do we mean by God? Given that I'm on a Christian radio station, I'm going to assume we mean the Christian God. And if we get our attributes of the Christian God from the Bible, what do we see? We see in the New Testament, second epistle to John, I think, that God is love. And we see in the Psalms that God is loving to all he has made. And we read in Corinthians that love always protects, love always perseveres, love never fails. And we look in the fossil record and see that 99% of all the species that have ever existed are now extinct. And they were extinct before the first people, and therefore before the time of any alleged fall of man or Noah's flood. And it's often thought that theistic evolution advances by nudging things in the right direction. You know, God sets the laws of nature up and he gives things a little prod to help move towards his goal, what he wants nature to achieve. But evolution doesn't work like that. It works not by nudging things in the right direction, but by nudging things in all directions and then killing off all the varieties that haven't worked very well. It's a very wasteful way of going in a particular direction. It gives the illusion that things have been guided, but it works not by pushing things in the right direction, but by killing off everything that's gone in the wrong direction. I mean, as Darwin himself said, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the cruel, blind, and horridly low, was it, works of nature. So the idea of a loving God, which is what the Christian God is meant to be, does not flow from a study of the fossil record, which shows that parasites, disease and predation were all around before the first people. I think if you can reconcile that with a loving God, you can really reconcile black with white.
What do you reckon then, John? Is this pertinent to the discussion we're having?
I think it is pertinent at a certain level. What, Robert, you're raising is really the problem that faces all believers in God, and the problem of theodicy. And your comment on the evil in the universe and the negative and so on. And I sympathise greatly with that, because we do not see a unified picture. On the other hand, to probe into it a little bit, when you are criticising it and saying it's evil and so on and so forth, I would be very interested where you get the concept of evil from. Because it seems to me that one of the things that atheism does, by its reductionist attempt to explain the universe, is undermine any ground for good and evil. And Richard Dawkins, the person that you look up to, as you've said, in one of his books, I don't think it's a devil's chaplain, I think it's a river out of Eden, says that at base the universe is just what we'd expect it to be. Pitiless, indifferent, there is no good, there is no evil, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now it seems to me there that he removes the basic criteria of even discussing good and evil. So that although a Christian like myself has problems with evil and disease and so on, and there are answers, I believe, at Christian level, it seems to me atheism doesn't even give you the grounds to criticise it. I don't know how you'd respond to that.
Well, I would say I didn't look at a definition of evil, I looked at a definition of love, and I got it from the Bible. Mm-hmm. Now let's look at this logically. If the Bible's wrong, there are obviously very profound very profound implications for the Christian faith. If it's right and my definitions of love were right, my point still stands, namely that we don't see evidence for a God of love in the fossil record. If the Bible is wrong, then my point as an atheist still stands. Well, another point I would make, that the Bible is not good evidence for God. Now, where do we get our sense of right and wrong from? Our sense of right and wrong has changed over the years. We no longer think of slavery, which was commanded in the Old Testament and sanctioned in the New, as being right. A lot of Christians don't think that various passages in the Old Testament, which have God allowing the rape of Midianite women, and I mean it says in the New Testament that Lot, a man who offered his virgin daughters up to be raped, was righteous. Now a lot of Christians don't believe in that. Christians are split on all kinds of things, like most recently the split in the Anglican Church over the ordination of gay bishops and just homosexual relationships in general. Now Christianity doesn't offer us consistent answers to what's right and wrong. Christians themselves can't agree. I would say, as an evolutionary biologist, where did good and evil come from? They're social constructs. That's why they've changed over time.
I mean, we could get into a lengthy debate on all the subjects that you've been mentioning there, but I mean, in a sense, I'd like to, try and move into the area that we're really here for. But these are all kind of, as it were, things that spring out of this whole debate, aren't they, in many ways?
They are.
And each one deserves a whole programme of its own in many ways to have that kind of discussion. I mean, when it comes to God, though, I mean, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, John, would you be happy to sort of say that God, you haven't exactly, you haven't defined in great detail what God is in the book, apart from being that if science appears to point towards a creator or designer, that for you must be God.
Yes, I think Robert has a point here, and I'm writing another book where that omission, if it is an omission, will be remedied. Richard Dawkins, in his recent book, makes a very strong distinction with which I'd agree, with a kind of vague Einsteinian God, equal to the laws of nature or some vague deistic God, with the God as revealed in Scripture, the God who created everything and so on, who is supernatural, very clearly, who reveals himself in history and above all is incarnate in Jesus Christ. God codes himself in humanity. That is the miraculous with a vengeance, so to speak. And that's the kind of God that I'm talking about. And I think that's pretty clear in my book, although it would perhaps have been good to have gone into the definition more, but I think people are under no illusion. I intended the book to be limited to the science-burying God. The questions that Robert has been raising are questions of the next order. They're vastly important. I agree with him. But it's another debate and it demands another book. I myself do believe what Scripture says about God and love and think there are very clear answers to his notions on slavery and so on. But it seems to me that is a separate debate.
And perhaps one that we will obviously have to leave for another day. But while we're defining terms, it might be useful to maybe just quickly, at least, define science as well. Because what for you, in a nutshell, would science be, Robert?
Well, I think most philosophers of science would agree that it subscribes to what's called methodological naturalism. That's the idea not that nature is all that there is, but that nature is all that we're going to use to describe things. So if you're a naturalist in that sense, you wouldn't exclude God from science because of a belief that God doesn't exist. You exclude him from science simply because when you bring him into scientific explanations, you cease to be believing in natural causes. You believe in, as John said, a supernatural cause. And once you allow the natural chain of cause and effect to be broken, for one instant, you can no longer be consistent in your understanding of the natural world, and scientific explanation breaks down. So I think natural John makes the point that the war isn't exactly between atheism and God. It's between naturalism and supernaturalism in science. I think you'd agree.
Well, I mean, given the definition that Robert's just given there, John, I mean, do you find that too limiting?
Yes, I think that methodological naturalism sounds very impressive, but for the most part it's utterly equivalent to methodological theism. Richard Dawkins says it's only apparently designed, I say it's designed. Now, when it comes down to actual hard science, the difference in the science you do, assuming that there's a God behind it, and the science you do, assuming that there's no God behind it, is 0 for 99.5 or more % of science. It's only in certain areas where this is going to make a real difference. And Robert, I sympathise here with you saying, let's watch where God is brought in case we become lazy thinkers and so on and so forth. However, I would want to say that it's like this. If you design a machine as a physicist that can only see visible light, and somebody comes along and says, well, X-rays exist, and I point my machine and say, no, I don't see anything, that doesn't prove X-rays don't exist. It simply shows that your machine is limited. And the problem, it seems to me, with assuming methodological naturalism as equal to science is actually imposing a philosophy on science. And the question I would want to ask, what happens if science done under the banner of the assumption of methodological naturalism actually points beyond it? In other words, it seems to me, to put it another way round, that there are good gaps and bad gaps. The bad gaps are the ones that science can close, and the ones which Robert and I both would be very much against. But it seems to me that assuming methodological naturalism, there are gaps that science reveals. And one of those, I would suggest, is the origin of the universe, and the other is the origin of life itself. I do think that it may be possible scientifically to observe and to see traces of God's activity. That is, the very existence of the whole show is evidence of something that transcends the natural. So that the assumption of methodological naturalism is okay, provided one realizes that it can limit you and stop you from following evidence if the evidence seems to be pointing beyond, and I think it does in certain
I
places.
think this is what a lot of people who are on, John's side, Robert, say, that you have to follow the evidence where it leads, and if it leads you beyond the realms of just the material and the natural, if the conclusions appear to lie in something, which started it all off, a divine cause or whatever it is, then why should we, because we've kind of got this particular worldview, completely discount that?
Well, John draws a very interesting distinction between what he calls good gaps and bad gaps. The good gaps, or John would say, is when science says not just we don't know how it could have happened, but we know it couldn't have happened by our current understanding of science. The bad gaps are when science just says we don't know how it happened. Now, my problem is that once you start trying to bring God into science, you have people who are too easily accept what they think are good gaps, but they're really bad ones. I'll give you an example of intelligent design theory. Now, one of the leading proponents of that is someone called Michael Behe, who's come up with the concept called irreducible complexity. I'll just, if I might, read his definition of it.
Are you going to tell us about a flagellum now, by any chance?
I'm not going to go... That's an example, one he gives, but I'll just give you an example. Let's have a look. There we are. Now, his definition was... I can't find it now. Sorry. Oh, yes. He defined irreducible complexity as a system that loses its function if any one part is removed. So that indicates, and some systems are like that, and the presence of such systems, he says, shows that the system didn't evolve by sequential addition of parts.
I've heard it given an analogy of a mousetrap.
Yes.
Quite a simple device, but if you removed one part of the mousetrap, the spring or the trap or the cheese or whatever, the trip mechanism, it would cease to function as a mousetrap, and it doesn't appear to have any function with unless all the parts are there from the start together. That's kind of the idea of irreducible complexity.
Yes.
It's been designed.
Is that because have they given up too quickly now? With the example of the mousetrap, that's not irreducibly complex. One part of the mousetrap is the base. Now, if you get rid of the base from a mousetrap, it's a lot less useful because you can't move it around, but it can still trap mice. And there's another problem with irreducible complexity. It only assumes that things can't evolve by the sequential addition of parts. But there are other ways in which evolution can work. For example, it can have something that isn't irreducibly complex, and then you can lose parts to get something that is. You can have addition of multiple parts, for example, by duplication of the entire system. So you can have a change of function. That's another important element. You can also have gradual modification of each part, so that a new part, which isn't at first essential to the system, gradually becomes essential, so that if you remove it, the system stops working. Now, all these mechanisms have been observed in the laboratory. We know in principle that irreducibly complex things can evolve. It's not a problem for evolution. In fact, it was anticipated in the 1930s. It was actually predicted by evolutionary theory. And what creationists today do is they put up a kind of straw man weakened version of evolutionary theory. They say evolutionary theory can't answer this. We know it can't, but they've only attacked a weak version of evolutionary theory.
Right, and you would say that the more you throw up examples of things which are apparently unanswerable, it's only a case of the science developing, and you probably will find the answers that you're looking for. And every time you posit this God as the explanation, you're actually doing a disservice to the whole point of science, which is to search for a natural explanation.
I'm not arrogantly asserting that science will solve everything, but what I am saying is that it's premature to say that science won't solve something. We should keep on trying.
Let's allow John, because you were busy scribbling away there, John, while Robert
there
was speaking.
Two or three major issues, and very important ones that Robert's addressing here. Back, first of all, to the question of methodological naturalism and the evidence pointing beyond. I find it very interesting that Anthony Flew, who until relatively recently was the world's leading humanist expert, and David Hume and so on, and I suppose Richard Dawkins' predecessor.
A very high-profile atheist.
A very high-profile atheist has come to state his belief in theism, and his reason has actually got to do with the nature of the complexity of the DNA molecule. But he makes a very interesting point. He says, what happens, somebody asked him, what happens if the evidence leads in directions that are against methodological naturalism? And he said, that's too bad. We must follow the evidence. So be it. And I think that's extremely important, that we must follow the evidence. Secondly, irreducible complexity is a fascinating thing, because it was Darwin, actually, who first defined it. And he said if there could be exhibited an organ that could not possibly have come about by numerous gradual additions, then my theory would absolutely break down, to which Richard Dawkins gives his explicit assent in one of his books. Now, the difficulty with this, and Robert's beginning to point to it, is that it involves proving a negative. And proving a negative is very difficult in science. Now, where I would want to stand there is, and this is where it begins to get a bit complicated, because I think the jury's out. Michael Behe has raised a furore, and people have taken it very seriously, because he's saying, right, there are various organisms that could not possibly, and then you get the kind of argument that Robert has brought. And so there's been a generation of many research papers on this, actually, in recent days. I want to say, as a mathematician, that what interests me is what underlies that debate. The flagellum is a molecular protein machine. And so we drop down a level to the actual nature of the information in DNA. Now, there are places in science where we can prove a negative. to beyond reasonable doubt. For example, the law of conservation of energy. If I get a paper, as I sometimes did when I was in my earlier days, claiming here is a 100-page article and here's the design for a perpetual motion machine, I didn't read it. Not because I was an obscurantist, but because I think there's sufficient evidence to believe in a law of conservation of energy. It's a proscriptive law. Now, it seems to me that the suggestion that Sir Peter Medawar made, that there's an analogous law of conservation of information, is something that needs following up. Now, some people have been doing this. I think a lot more work needs to be done. But the suggestion would be that natural processes, which are brilliant at transmitting information and processing and optimizing, as they do in certain evolutionary processes, microevolution. I have no difficulty with what Darwin observed. Where I have difficulty is with the creative process, that those natural processes cannot create information. Now, that goes down to the level much lower than Michael Behe is studying, and I think that's an important thing. But I think something needs to be said, thirdly, more in general. There's a danger in thinking that evolution is the big issue, that, for example, my faith in God depends on whether or not a theorem in biology is true or false. Now, I would want to say very clearly that you cannot deduce atheism from evolutionary biology. First of all, philosophically, that's a category mistake. Secondly, you will find there are many evolutionary biologists who are keen Christians, including Darwin's major supporter, the USA, Asa Gray. It seems to me there are two questions here. The first question is, can you deduce atheism from evolutionary biology? And I say no, because that's philosophically impossible. And secondly, can evolutionary theory bear all the weight that's put on it? Now, at the first level, just to make my final point here, I do not think that the major evidence for God comes in the bits of science we don't understand. I think it comes in the bits we do. And I would want to step back from a discussion of the details of the flagellum, although they're very interesting, and say, look, the very fact that we can do science points towards God. What I mean by that is the universe is rationally intelligible. I don't think atheism has any explanation for that whatsoever, but theism does.
We are going to we'll look into this in more detail in the next section, because we're already coming towards the end of our first section of programming. And we'll allow, obviously, Robert to respond to some of these things. And this is already, quite a high, we're using terms such as methodological, but don't let that scare you, because we're going to try and bring things down to a level where we'll try and just make things as clear as we can in this programme, so that you understand where the arguments lie and why John and Robert disagree so much about the nature of science and whether God can be brought into the equation, whether God actually made the equation in the first place, I suppose. We're going to be looking at all those sorts of issues. So do stay with us. And let me tell you, as I said earlier on, you can contribute yourself. Send me a message by email. That's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. I wonder what you think about this whole discussion that's going on between science and religion. And if you want to leave me a voicemail message, I'll very happily play that out in next week's programmes. And I'm very happy to forward them on to our guests as well. That's 08456 52 52 52. Select option 5. That's the unbelievable voicemail option. 08456 52 52 52. Tell me what you think about what we're talking about today. And what we're talking about is, has science buried God? That's our question. John Lennox has been described as God's Undertaker, or should we say his resurrection agent? I don't know, but
certainly not God's Undertaker.
But that's the title of his book, God's Undertaker. Has science buried God? That's sort of some of the arguments that John's putting forward in that book, to the effect that science, in terms of the way we now understand it, in many ways points towards God, points towards there being a designer, a creator, and we'll continue to look at those and hear replies from Robert as we continue the programme. Do stay with me. This is Justin Brierley with Unbelievable. Well, before we go back to our discussion with Robert Stovold and John Lennox, let me tell you that if you'd like to get hold of a copy of that TV debate that I mentioned earlier, that John was involved with Richard Dawkins last week in the States on the God delusion, you can get hold of it. A really interesting debate between the two of them. That's available from fixed-point.org. That's the name of the organisation, Fixed Point, and their website again, fixed-point.org. Let me tell you also that next week we're going to be looking at Judaism and Christianity and talking about salvation with a Jewish rabbi and a Christian guest. So do join me for that.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Got a Christian and an atheist in the studio with me today, but both have pursued academic interest in science. John Lennox is from the University of Oxford. He is a fellow in mathematics and the philosophy of science at Green College. Also with me, Robert Stovold, who has a background in evolutionary biology. He's an atheist, a humanist, and he's been telling us why he contests the ideas of John that God is at the centre, at the basis, really, of most of our scientific understanding, that what science does for us these days is actually point to the way that God is a necessary part of our understanding of science. And we're going to be looking at why exactly John believes that, and seeing what Robert has to say about it as well. So let's continue this discussion, gentlemen. I mean, you were saying, just as we had to wrap up our last section, John, that you can't understand the universe, in your opinion, unless there is some kind of divine basis to it. I mean, just in simple language, trying to explain how you arrive at that
What I'm
conclusion.
referring to is Einstein's famous comment that the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And the principle of order that lies behind all of science. There's often a caricature that people think that faith is only in religion and therefore not worth talking about, and that there's no faith in science. I think that is a very simplistic analysis, that every scientist, in order to do science, has got to believe that the universe is accessible to the human mind, at least in part. That is, it's rationally intelligible. C.S. Lewis puts it in a lovely little pithy expression. Men, I'm afraid it was men then, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, science exploded in the 16th and 17th century from a Christian cradle, and far from Christian belief hindering science, it motivated it. And Joseph Needham, the expert Oxford sinologist as well as chemist, the expert on China, pointed out that you didn't get a similar development in China because they didn't have this unifying principle. Now, what I want to say is this. Atheism, as J.B.S. Haldane pointed out years ago, reduces everything to physics and chemistry. And he made the famous statement, if the thoughts in my mind are simply the results of the motions of atoms in my brain, why should I even believe that my brain is composed of atoms? In other words, the reductionist atheist position seems to me to undermine that belief in rational intelligibility that science demands.
This is where you get, as it were, philosophy,
Absolutely.
The philosophy of science. And
yes,
that's obviously a key area for you. Now, perhaps philosophy isn't particularly in your background, Robert, but do you see the points that John's making here? What is your belief actually based on?
Well, John takes an intelligible universe and uses that to argue for the presence of an intelligible designer, if you like. Now, there are several points worthy of note here. First of all, that if we're going to agree that the universe is intelligible, why not just assert the universe is intelligible and that's that? Why go the extra mile and invoke a god? It goes an extra step. And it seems to me to be an unnecessary step. If you believe God created the universe, well, we know from Einstein's theory of relativity that time had a beginning in the Big Bang. Now, to talk of anything creating the Big Bang is to talk about something happening before time, which can't happen. It's meaningless. You know, how long before time? 1 second, 2 seconds? You can't have a before time. All questions of causation break down at the Big Bang. So to say God caused the order or intelligibility of the universe is actually refuted by standard Big Bang cosmology. So I think it's on the side of the atheists.
John, any response to that? I mean, you're just saying that it just doesn't.
I'm saying it's logically impossible for God to cause something, to cause the universe to exist, because that implies causing time, which implies doing something before time, which is impossible. It's like going north of the North Pole. You can't do it.
Well, firstly, there are 2 points there. The first one was, why not just assume the universe is intelligible? That strikes me as a very surprising statement for a scientist, because we're always looking for explanations, and the very intelligibility of the universe demands explanation. Indeed, Paul Davies draws attention to this in one of his books. He's a very clever but very good popular science writer. And he talks in one of his books precisely about this. He says it's a very odd thing that many scientists, and he is not a theist, but he said it's a very odd thing that many scientists come down and then they say, well, it's just a brute fact. And they lose their curiosity about the biggest thing of all. That is the whole show. I am, on the second point, very sceptical of that kind of argument. The nature of God and the nature of the universe, the statement in Scripture, in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. And that statement seems to me to make perfect sense, that God is eternal. He has always existed. The universe came to be. And it seems to me that there's nothing in Einstein, or the kind of logic you claim, to argue against the fact that God caused the whole show to exist. Now, what God's relationship to time is, I suspect, is extremely sophisticated. How many dimensions the universe has in its visible side and its invisible side, I wouldn't want to say.
But isn't this the reason why people like Robert are saying, you keep God out of science? Because when you start talking about God, you start to go beyond the realm of what we can actually understand. So we've got to...
But I don't bring God into science. What I do is to say that it's important you ask that question. What I say is that science is pointing towards God in its very existence. That's not bringing God into science.
You're a mathematician by background, so you know about this stuff, but you talk about the probabilities of the universe as we know it and what would have had to have happened in those first nanoseconds of, Big Bang or whatever. Is this what we call the fine-tuning argument?
The fine-tuning argument is this, that what we've discovered in the last relatively recent past in physics and cosmology is that the fundamental constants of nature have to be within very, very close tolerances in order to have a universe like this in which carbon-based life is possible. And the numbers are mind-boggling. Sir Roger Penrose, I think, is responsible for one of the biggest one. He says if you want a universe like this with a second law of thermodynamics, which in popular language means that even your Rolls-Royce will rust, the creator, and he does not believe in a creator, but he puts it this way, the creator has to have a name accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, which, as he points out, is a number so big that if you were to write it down, you couldn't, putting a zero in every elementary particle in the universe because there aren't enough elementary particles. So that kind of thing leads some physicists, not all, as Robert will be very quick to point out, I think, but leads some physicists, like Paul Davies again, to say the evidence of design is overwhelming. Now, this has nothing to do with biology.
No.
And it's an argument not from gaps in knowledge. It's an argument from knowledge, and that's very important. We didn't know about the fine-tuning some years back. And Fred Hoyle, when he first discovered the resonances in carbon that are necessary for the production of the atoms that we know are needed for the chemistry of the universe, said nothing shook his atheism more than that discovery, how accurate it had to be. Now, There are alternative explanations, which I suspect you're about to hear, but let me say that it is something there. We can illustrate it on a much simpler level. Look at planet Earth. If we were nearer to the sun, carbon-based life wouldn't be possible because of the heat. If we were further away because of the cold. If the spin of the Earth were greater, we'd all fly off into space. If it were slower, we'd bake to death in the daytime and freeze to death at night. So that even those parameters have to be within very close tolerances in order to have life as we know it. This is just extrapolating that to the nth degree.
Well, it seems to me that theists are trying to have it both ways here. On the one hand, they say that God's goal was to create life. And on the other hand, they say, well, the universe is so designed that if anything was even slightly different, life couldn't be here. Life's very rare. Imagine you had a patio with little weeds growing up between the cracks, and you lived in one of these cracks, and you said, oh, whoever put this patio into existence has brought it here in order to have fertile cracks in which the weeds can grow. Now that to me,
you're saying that
you're ignoring the huge areas of the universe where there's no life at all. Now, on the subject of fine-tuning, we don't know whether the knob of the universe, if you like, is twiddleable. We don't know whether they're free to vary the fundamental values of the constants. If they are, then the precise values that they have does require an explanation. If they're not, it doesn't. The burden of proof lies with those who believe that any other universe than the one we live in is possible. The burden of proof lies with them to prove that the constants can vary. Now let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that scientists tomorrow discovered that the universe wasn't tunable, that somehow the fundamental properties of the fundamental values of these constants had to be. What would theologians do? They'd say to themselves, well, let's liken the universe to a radio and ask whether God would make it a tunable radio or not. God knows what he wants in advance, doesn't he? He knows everything. So why would he make a radio tunable? He'd build it so that it picks up the right station. He wouldn't sit there twiddling a knob and make it tunable. So why make a universe that's tunable? So if science revealed an untunable universe, theologians would leap on that as sound proof that God exists. And if it reveals a tunable universe, they'd leap on it. Oh, well, a tunable universe, it's all tuned to facilitate life, so that requires a divine tuner. Theologians can come up with explanations for anything. So it ends up describing absolutely nothing. And they're very complicated explanations as well. Do you accept that if the universe was found to be completely untunable, theologians could come up with a very good explanation? You know, God would make it untunable. Why would he make a universe? He can change. He already knows what he wants. So theologians would probably say that, wouldn't they, if the universe was found to be untunable?
But I'm not sure that the issue is whether it's tunable or untunable.
You've assumed it's tunable.
The issue is that on the basis of our science, that the constants have to be within these very close tolerances. And many of the physicists, all of them I've talked to, suggest that these things could be slightly different. And that's the basis on which I am working, that fine-tuning is a phenomenon accepted by all physicists. And usually the way they get out of it, and that's why I'm rather surprised by what you just said, Robert, the way they say, Mark Tegmark, the physicist at Princeton, says, either the fine-tuning demands a creator or there is a multiverse, if I come in on the atheist side for a moment. And that's why you get many people like Sir Martin Rees here saying, I prefer the multiverse, even though there's not the slightest shred of evidence for it. That is the idea that there are many universes. And so we're the one in which. Now, I think there's a good answer to that. So the fine-tuning is a phenomenon with which physics is reckoning. It's there. And it seems to me that the theistic explanation is the obvious one that they admit. So they admit it, and then they say, but it may be there's a multiverse. Right. Which, of course, doesn't exclude God either. But that's another matter.
Exactly. It doesn't exclude God either. In fact, if we knew the multiverse idea was true, theologians would say, well, that just shows how wonderful God is. He didn't just do one universe, he did lots of them. So theologians would always find something. You find
theologians rather slippery, and they'll just use anything to justify.
I do, yes. I mean, if you have
previously held belief.
If you have an unbroken chain of cause and effect, they say God's a lawmaker. If you see a break in that chain, you say it's a miracle, God did it. So theologians seem to win either way.
Oh, well, half a minute. Now, that's a completely different thing. On the first point, the actual multiverse theory, and I have an atheist friend, actually, who's a philosopher of physics, and he says to me it doesn't alter the actual fine-tuning argument in this universe. So your conclusion is not quite right. Secondly, the business of miracle is another matter altogether, and I would just like to point out there that the notion of miracle requires there to be law. It's not an either or. We wouldn't be able to recognize a miracle like the resurrection of Jesus Christ if we didn't know that dead people normally didn't rise. It's the knowledge of the actual regularities of the universe enable us to recognize when God has fed a new event in. So I don't think the two things are parallel at all.
Well, I'd like to move us on from this debate, as fascinating as it is. Before we go into maybe a new section, let me just say that if you're listening and you want to comment on anything you're hearing, you've got a question, whatever it may be, once again, the number, if you'd like to leave a voicemail message, is 08456 52 52 52. Select option 5. And you can email me, that's unbelievable@premier.org.uk.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Now, we've been going at it at quite a high scientific level this afternoon, and if you want to listen back, maybe just to kind of allow some of those points to settle in your mind and have time to think about it, I do recommend you catch this programme online, because that's a great way to listen back. Go to premier.org.uk/radio. Click on my Unbelievable webpage there. You can get an archive copy of this from about Monday, and you can get the podcast as well. Get it downloaded regularly to your MP3 player, and you can maybe mull over some of the arguments that are flying here in the studio. You're also welcome, of course, to go to the website in order to purchase a copy of John's book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? That's available at the Premier shop. That's premier.org.uk/shop. Available in regular shops too. The publisher is Lion. Gentlemen, one thing that I wanted to do, and this is in regard specifically to the book, was Robert, having read it, had the chance to read it, you were concerned at some aspects of the way John tackles certain scientists and quotes them, and you felt that sometimes they were misrepresented. Is this the case?
Well, I think they were, yes. I mean, if we take what Lewontin said about materialism. Now, let's see, John quotes him as saying, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. And he goes on to say that we'll carry on believing in this no matter how counterintuitive it seems.
Right.
So he's called science patently absurd. Now, if you look in the context of what Lewontin was saying, he was actually saying that it was in the context of a book review, and he said, with great perception, Carl Sagan sees there is no impediment to the popular credibility of scientific claims about the world. There is an impediment, an impediment that's almost invisible to most scientists. When at the time of the moon landing, a woman in rural Texas was interviewed about the event, she very sensibly refused to believe the television pictures she'd seen had come all the way from the moon, on the grounds that her antenna couldn't even get Dallas. What seems absurd depends on one's prejudice. He wasn't saying science is absurd. He was only saying it seems absurd. And yet he's been quoted out of context here. The reader is left with a distinct impression that Lewontin is saying that science is absurd. Furthermore, this bias is backed up. Lewontin's conclusion is we mustn't allow a divine foot in the door. But he gives a very good reason for why we mustn't allow a divine foot in the door. And he says right after the bit that's quoted, he says that we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who believed in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles would happen. It wasn't simply that he doesn't like God, it's that once the laws of cause and effect break down, you can't do science.
Right.
He had a very good objective reason
and you're suggesting
for rejecting it, and you don't pick up on that.
You don't pick that up in the context of the way John's using the quotation.
No.
I mean, John, any defence of what you've
what I would say is this, that Lewantin's quotation, which is a very famous one and has been analysed by philosophers of science and so on all over the place, it does indicate that we can't allow a divine foot in the door. And the point I was making is that comes from his materialistic prejudice. That is not something that science is telling them. In fact, I didn't emphasize, I let his quotation stand, I didn't emphasize, and I'm interested you picked that up, and perhaps it demands qualification in another edition. I will note your point. I wasn't aiming to suggest that he thought science was absurd. I was aiming to suggest what I think he himself is suggesting, that if it's a choice, that we'll pursue something that's patently absurd rather than be prepared to accept that science is pointing towards God, which is the point I was making earlier. In other words, he will insist on keeping it within a naturalistic framework. And that, I think, is going beyond science. And I don't think the extra bit of quotation, which I'd be very happy to add in actually, makes any difference to that. It's saying we stick by naturalism. And I think that Lewantin's conclusion, of course, is false, that it comes down to God can spring it at any point and the whole thing becomes arbitrary. I tried to make that point earlier with the question of
and
miracles.
We've covered this to some extent
Yes.
already, that this is a kind of repainting the discussion we've already had, Robert, that for you, when as soon as you start bringing, I say bringing God, but you say it points to God, John, but disregarding that, you just feel that at that point science breaks down, because you start to just say, well, God did it.
I'm grateful to Robert for pointing this out, because it does indicate, if he read it that way, that I could perhaps repackage it better. So thanks for that.
I know there's more that you'd like to refer to, Robert, but unfortunately time isn't going to allow us to do that. But thank you for, we certainly haven't let John off the hook on the programme today, and it's been jolly interesting. There are many, many more aspects to this discussion that we could go into, and we haven't been able to get to nearly everything that I was hoping we'd be able to cover on the programme today, but such is the nature of these kinds of discussions. But it's been phenomenally interesting, and once again, the book that we've been looking at is by John Lennox. It's God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Available at the Premier shop, premier.org.uk/shop. Perhaps, do you want to just wrap up maybe your final thoughts here? Robert, you obviously have come at this, with an open mind, and you're a scientist, you're someone who does follow the evidence where it leads. I mean, have you, going back to that really initial thing that we started off talking about, I mean, have you ruled out God a priori as, because...
no,
and therefore the evidence couldn't point to God because God doesn't exist?
No, I do think when you make remarkable claims, you need remarkable amounts of evidence to back them up. And a God is so much more remarkable than the natural world we see around us, that to me it requires a remarkable amount of evidence to back him up. And we simply don't have that. Okay.
Thank you very much for being part of the programme today, and I hope we can get you back at some point in the future, because you've just done, I think, brilliantly well, representing the atheist side, if you like. John, a couple of final thoughts from you?
Well, I agree with Robert. I think that you do need remarkable evidence, and that's why the evidence from science and nature is only part of it. And in response to what he said, and he's put his finger on an important thing, I want to bring in the evidence of history, particularly the evidence concerning Christ, his life, his death, his resurrection, and the evidence of experience, because we do need very strong evidence, especially in light of the kind of deep problem that Robert mentioned at the very beginning. And here I, as a Christian, as distinct from merely a theist, would want to say that taking God out of the equation actually makes those deep problems worse, But in Christ's death and resurrection, we see the possibility of an answer. But that's another big story for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us. My guests today were Dr. John Lennox, Professor at Green College in Oxford, and Robert Stovold, background there in evolutionary biology, very kindly coming in to represent, as it were, the atheist scientific sort of viewpoint. And thank you for listening. As I say, you can listen again via the webpage, premier.org.uk/radio. Try back there on Monday or Tuesday. You'll be able to download the programme as an MP3 file. You'll be able to listen back to it at your leisure. Well, something completely different next week. Let's tell you what's happening then.
You're unbelievable.
I've got a rabbi joining me on the programme, Rabbi Reuben Livingstone. He's going to be telling us what Jews believe about salvation. And we'll also be joined by Christian Alex Jacob from the Church's Ministry Among Jewish People, as he gives us what he believes salvation is all about. We'll be looking at the whole concept and what the two faiths share in common and where they disagree. And I'm sure we'll be having a most interesting discussion. That's at the same time here on Unbelievable, 2 to 3:30. Hope you can join me.